You're listening to the Good Morning Show on WBOK 1230 AM.
We're back. Welcome back to the Good Morning Show with OT and Charmel, whatever her name may be at the particular.
Look, it's a tough name. At some point, we're going to talk about how I got that name. But I appreciate that folks are trying to involve me in the conversation.
At least they're calling you.
They are.
Just start with Charm and then put the L on it. Charmel. Charmel. Well, anyway, now that we're trying to get her name right. Wow, great discussion about race. 504-260-9265. We're going to continue that discussion about wealth and African Americans and racism, and have we adopted the culture of the system? Mm-hmm. Are we exempt from that? And that discussion is going to be led by the great Ann Price, the director of Closing the Racial Wealth Gap initiative in America, which some people it says is the greatest challenge we face right now in terms of independence. We know we have the Missing Piece campaign with Liberty, the Tribune, and WBOK. And is our economic, closing the economic gap, when you look at statistics from 150 years ago to now, all the great conversation, whether it's Claude Anderson or Tony Brown, some of the great economists, is it our greatest challenge?
I believe it is. I believe our greatest challenge is thinking about what's the future opportunity for our young people.
I'll jump right into the discussion. Who is Miss Ann Price, and what is the Closing the Racial Wealth Gap Initiative? I'm sorry, Miss Price.
Hi. Well, thank you. I'm actually here as a guest of a great coalition here in Louisiana called LA Best, Building Economic Security Together, here with Miss Joyce James. And really what we're talking about when we talk about racial wealth, a racial wealth gap, is we're talking about wealth as an opportunity. Wealth is opportunity. It is that reserve that helps you deal with economic setbacks when you lose a job, a medical emergency. Mm-hmm. It is what helps you retire with dignity. But mainly what it does is it helps you provide opportunities for your children to be who they are, to realize their God-given talents. And that's the way I really talk about this wealth gap. It's really about opportunity. It's kind of an opportunity gap. And it is growing wider and wider and wider. Even before the recession, after the recession, we are seeing just growing inequality.
Really framing it in the opportunity language, I think, is something that's important, right? Because we, as Americans, we talk a lot about being the land of opportunity. And when we have a conversation about race, people often shut down because of the words and language we use. But when you frame it in terms of opportunity and everyone having this chance at full opportunity, you open it up to bring more people into the conversation.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
So when you think about this opportunity piece, what are some of the main impediments that African Americans are facing in really seizing opportunity in America now?
Well, one of the things I really want to say in the onset is a lot of times when I talk about wealth, people really get into individual achievements, and in building wealth, and we can build this wealth, and it gets down to people talk about people's personal responsibility, and that's not the frame I'm talking about. Of course, we all need financial education. That's all good and that's all important, but I'm really talking about the kind of structures that get in the way of people's opportunity, no matter how hard they try, no matter how hard they work. And when we look at the financial structure and services in this country right now, we're seeing that money is just really being siphoned and extracted out of black communities through payday lending, through title loans, through for-profit colleges, you name it. These are entities that are designed to strip money out of our communities. And the whole housing crisis was a means to siphon wealth out of communities.
And Price, you just said something. The person who rode in on the white horse to help, in many cases, is helping to suppress and drain wealth from the African American community.
Unprecedented.
That's your analysis.
Yes. You can't look at these structures and not see that they're predatory systems in our communities that were designed to extract money. A payday lending is a design to keep people in a debt trap, And why do they exist and where do they exist? Those predatory lending operations were situated looking at looking at their credit scores. And you can look at a pattern on where they're located. Mm-hmm. And they were really designed for low income, working income, mainly
like liquor stores and tobacco advertising.
That's right. You can just look at the physical location of where they are, and the proliferation. Where are they proliferated? Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. I mean, are 3 states where you can see just outrageous predatory.
The Wealth of Challenge. Our dollar stays in our community only 8 hours.
Yes.
You have worked to explain it, to describe it. Are there solutions?
There are solutions, but they're not easy. We were just talking about where do we start? Because there's so many structures we've got to address, right? Education, criminal justice, housing, all those things interplay with each other, You can't think about a school system without thinking about housing, But I think that we have to think about what made our communities strong in the first place. We had strong communities. We had strong communities even when we were segregated, 50 years ago, and poor.
And this is really important. So I want folks to make sure that they tune into what Ann Price is saying. She's the director of Closing the Racial Wealth Gap Initiative, because we often have this discussion as if we are coming from a place of deficit as opposed to a place of strength. So talk to us a little bit more about the strong communities we have.
Well, I think so. I mean, oftentimes when we talk about these issues, we hear the most horrifying and negative statistics. But think back to school systems where people and communities where people live together of all kind of economic backgrounds, and the kind of teachers, for example, that were in our schools, that were part of our community. They weren't just in the school, they were part of our communities. Mm-hmm. And they had such high standards for our young people. And so if we think about communities that worked together, that thought about the education of their children in a way that just doesn't exist today. But we are not coming from a deficit. We're coming from a strong place, but we have to regain that sense of strength.
Now, explain that. Like you, I believe in the glass is half full. Mm-hmm. When people see distressed communities, some people talk about how bad people are doing. I like to say that there are a few people doing well.
Yes.
And a lot of people doing bad. We need to find out how we emulate that few people that are doing well in that distressed community. So you're saying that it's an opportunity there.
There is an opportunity there. And we can think about some of our neighborhoods that have been transformed. What happened there? There was investment. There was economic development investment without pushing out the people that live there. There was housing improvements, and there was some attention to the schools.
So gentrification doesn't necessarily have to equate improvement.
Well, it doesn't necessarily have to equate improvement.
We can rebuild neighborhoods and have traditional people or indigenous folk. I like to call people in the cities indigenous folk. Maybe they'll get more historical standing. We can have them maintaining those communities while we're improving those communities.
That's right. That's what we need to be doing, because we've lost so many communities to gentrification, and it happens so rapidly. But, we have to think about how do we work in coalition together to be able to do that. I mean, it takes quite a bit of organizing and coalition building to be able to be focused over the long term to transform neighborhoods who have become so distressed.
I really want you to hone in on some of your work to really highlight policies that focus on that investment piece without push out, because for folks who may not know you, they need to understand the place that you play and the role you play in the national sphere about bringing experts of color forward and really highlighting some of those gaps and policies that can ameliorate that.
Well, yes, we bring together experts from all over the country who are working on a number of issues and areas, from jobs to housing to looking at our financial structures. And certainly when you think about, wealth disparities, I mean, they're deeply rooted in historical policies. That we can't get away from our past because of redlining and discrimination and policies that still are with us today. But I'll take one policy that some folks are pushing for, and it's pretty bold, and it's called a jobs guarantee. And what it basically is saying that the government will act as a employer of last resort. Mm-hmm. That means that it will help to make investments in the community mm-hmm. by employing people and giving them a wage with some benefits. Now, think about what this could do. And this isn't so completely radical because we do this in some other ways through, through conservation corps and so forth. But it would do a few things. One, it would give people decent wages and some opportunity to build money for retirement. Secondly, it would help deal with discrimination and those folks have been completely locked out of the labor market who are in our communities today. We know that we have unemployment rates in some neighborhoods upwards of
52% of African American men in this region, in this New Orleans, are unemployed.
That's right. I did some work down here working with fathers who have child support debt and listening to their stories about their wanting to care for their kids, but because they have a debt, and that's a whole nother issue, you could go to jail for that, then you're further locked out of the job market. There's reasons why we are seeing this rampant, levels of joblessness that are crippling our communities because these men are in our communities, and who's caring for these men?
But you just mentioned, and look, we have a lot of real severe issues, very troubling issues in our community. But I love the fact, look, Chamel talks about coming from a place of love. No matter how desperate, if you come from a place of love, then you have a better chance at a positive outcome. You're saying that even as dire as it seems, the glass is half full, there's an opportunity. Right now in this town, we have the collection of black scientists are in town. Mm-hmm. We have African Americans like yourself, and talking about the wealth gap and wealth creation. They're in town. Last night, I was at the GVRS, Group Violence Reduction, a banquet where some of the city's most violent young men graduated to jobs in education. So there are all of these positive things working. How do we synchronize these things while building from the glass is half full and take advantage of it?
Well, there's always a lot of efforts going on, and I think, here in this city where there has been greater attention to New Orleans. But sometimes these efforts aren't as coordinated and thinking through what would take people from A to B and who would need to be involved along the way. If you thought about from jobs to help to housing and not be so piecemeal. And that's part of the issue.
Say that again.
Piecemeal efforts. That if we thought strategically, and that's what our work is in trying to work with groups down here like LA Best, is thinking about strategies that are more cohesive and really try to get at some of the issues. I mean, when we look at some of the data here, and you talked about these unemployment of men, it happens so early. Yet, where are intervention strategies early enough and coordinate enough to really get at some of these issues?
Chamel, no greater need for the collaborative than now. Nonprofits, folk that deal with the African American distress community, stop protecting your turf. Let's have a holistic approach. At least let's start dealing with the one issues at a time while we check them off the list.
That's what's also really interesting about being in New Orleans, having worked in Mississippi, and also seeing what's going on in Baton Rouge. There's some really intense coalition building that I haven't seen happen here. And I wonder about what that space is. It may be that we, in Mississippi, there weren't that many of us. So we can get in a room in a much easier way to address an issue. In Baton Rouge, they are constantly under the gun. So I think about people being forced to get in the room to have the conversation. But it's going to be really interesting to see what sparks the conversation here. And a part of what I really hope people are taking away from our conversation is their opportunity to really draw other people in to their thought process. That's why we have this whole talk on the Good Morning Show Monday through Friday.
But Ms. Price, as a social scientist on wealth, and you're an expert, you've studied that area, who can black folk blame that our dollar says in our community 8 hours, that we strategically and intentionally believe that other ice is colder, other professionals are better, other products are better. Who's to blame for that?
I think we have to look at this in two ways. We have to look at the structures that get in the way of us being able to build and maintain thriving business. And we have to think about our own attitudes as well towards our community and what investments we want to make to live in thriving communities. Our dollar doesn't turn over. Other communities can turn over a dollar 6 times. We know who's running businesses in our communities, and it's not us. So, and sometimes you often hear, I'm not going to go to that business. I'm going to go somewhere else. So we have to think about our attitudes towards our communities, but we also have to break down these barriers. How do most black businesses get started? Not through a bank loan, through credit cards.
Say that again?
That's really important.
Through credit cards is often the way that people start to finance their business, through using credit cards and maybe using $5,000, $6,000, $10,000 in credit cards to open a business,
which has an interest rate that's significantly higher than what you would be able to get
certainly.
from a bank.
Certainly.
And now with the credit crunching, your inability to have access to this type of credit, we see black business not being able to start or capitalize in the same way.
Powerful point. Some of the most successful black businesses, when I sit down and talk to them, they did not start with a low interest, a moderate interest bank loan, bank loan. They started with pooling money and maxing out their own credit to start their own successful business.
Right. And then you have to talk about what supports do our businesses need to be successful. When I looked at some of the data here in Louisiana, you think about why businesses fail is, one, having supports to know how to run a great business. You ever been in a community and gone into a business and say, oh my goodness, how is this person running this business?
Absolutely.
So greater supports are needed. So that folks can have the skills to run that business. So that's another critical factor. And thinking about small business, micro businesses, which are under 5 employees. There is a movement afoot to say if we can build out these micro businesses, we can do something in our communities, but they need support.
When you talk about we can do something in our community, all of the data shows that when cultural-based businesses, I don't like to say race-based, that's a whole other term. When cultural-based businesses open, when businesses that identify with their culture or their race open, then you impact unemployment or employment in your area. Right. So the solution is still there, that more successful African-American businesses, then you have less unemployed African-American men. Then you have you create more wealth, more home ownership, stronger families. Right. That data still applies.
Yeah, it certainly does. I mean, you can think about some folks that have been locked out of the mainstream job market that could start businesses that could then provide the income they need to be able to stay in the community. It is a viable mechanism, but it's not. If you think about the percentage of black businesses, it's extremely small. So it's not a vehicle for everyone, but it is a vehicle for some.
There's something that Jamel and I have talked about, the myth or or what Hollywood sells or what they sell about wealth and how to gain wealth, especially with the drug trade and illegal activity. And then when you analyze it and put the science to it, you see that the so-called drug game, which is so lucrative, actually impoverishes the African American community more. Because if the family mortgages the house, they got to get bond. You're making so much money selling drugs that you can't even have a good lawyer. You got a public defender. Then when you go to prison, your family's impacted more, so they got to put money on your books. So the myth, even about the wealth there, is actually helping drain our community.
Yeah, I think we have to think differently about wealth. I think people they think of income as wealth. And that's not wealth. So someone with a high income. In fact, really, let me just talk about a couple of facts. I think it's really important. That wealth, and what wealth is basically what you own minus what you owe. And when we look at wealth amongst blacks, it's so incredibly small. Let me just give you one statistics. Liquid wealth, liquid assets, which is basically something you can convert to cash. Blacks have a median wealth of $25. Black single women have about $100 in wealth the last time we did a study. So you're talking about very, very little, that piece I talked about, opportunity, what you have left to, as a nest egg, what you have left to help finance your children's education. We're talking about liquid assets of $25. So when people see someone driving in a big car, which is really not a real big asset, it might help you get to work, but it's not a real, it's a depreciating asset. That is not wealth, you know. So we have to think differently about our notions about what wealth is, and it's not income, because actually middle class blacks have less wealth than high school dropouts who are white.
I had a conversation with Chamel about with a real prominent African American female. I'm not going to mention the name. When I asked her, what does she identify as a good mate in a black man, and she said a job in a nice foreign car.
Bless her heart.
And that was what she you know, nothing about wealth, career. She says a nice job in a not a nice American car. She said a nice foreign car. Our standards of what success and wealth is, it's in line with your conversation. And that's really has nothing to do with wealth.
It has nothing to do with wealth. It has nothing to do with wealth. And I think that's why it's so important to start so young with our children, to help them understand what this is really about, right? Because aspirations for, and I'm not saying aspirations for to be a lawyer or a doctor are not important, or, you know, to be a rap mogul. But what we see are material things that we equate with wealth. Mm-hmm. And I think that, you know, when someone goes out in the world and starts working and seeing really what it is to struggle day by day to get by, we're selling our kids a bill of goods. I think certainly having stability, having some security, mm-hmm. that when something happens, your whole life won't unravel.
Having a nice car.
I don't know about a nice car is fine, but I think that the emphasis on that is misdirected, is misguided, right?
So we've been speaking with Ms. Ann Price. She's the director of Closing the Racial Wealth Gap Initiative for the Insight Center for Community Economics. And I wanted to come back to this point that you made about middle-class blacks having less assets than whites with a high school diploma.
Absolutely.
That have dropped out of high school.
Dropped out of high school.
Correct.
So how does that happen?
Well,
listen close, listening audience. This is important.
It happens mainly because how people really generate wealth is being able to pass on wealth from one generation to the next. And how do they do that? They do that by helping, for example, helping you put a down payment on a house, mm-hmm. by paying for your education. That gives you a leg up and a storage of resources that you can then pass down. So when we even look at home ownership rates, we don't have, there's a really, really wide gap between our home ownership rates, and that is a mechanism for building wealth. But being able to say, hey, I'm going to give you $30,000 to buy a house, I mean, these are things that oftentimes we don't have access to. So that is what helps people build wealth over time. And that's what's missing. So that's going back to the point of saying, yes, you can have those material things and have a decent income, but doesn't mean you have a storage of resources to draw upon. And that's why we see people seeing people falling out of the middle class when they lose their jobs. Mm. What happens when people lose their jobs, and what we've seen, particularly even with older blacks, I'm talking about people in their 40s and 50s who've had a very difficult time recovering in this economy. You've seen people's lives unravel. So, also in thinking about the foreclosure crisis, that hit our community so hard across economic strata.
I'd like to use the Lower Ninth Ward as an example. I grew up in that neighborhood. Mm-hmm. It's a poor neighborhood, but we had the highest percentage of home ownership of African Americans of any neighborhood in this area, mm-hmm. in the state. Mm-hmm. That area is challenged right now, post-Katrina. many of the African Americans who own their own property, who that was the wealth we transferred from
That's
one
right.
generation to the next, that is lost.
Yes.
So what you're saying is that is how you begin to count in America,
Right.
by having something a value that you can transfer to the next generation.
That is exactly it. If you think about the houses, some of the houses that were lost in Katrina, some of the issues were about cloudy titles, like who owned the house, right? So you had a house that your grandmother had, but no one could figure out who owned it, right? And some of those homes are lost. So this kind of what we call heir property rights has also been something. Tax liens that have, that people were given a house by a grandmother, an aunt, a mother, and couldn't pay the taxes, and the house was lost. So we've lost land, we've lost farmland, we've lost houses, and a lot of our access to wealth. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Not enough time for this discussion. We talk about race, we talk about public policy and politics, but Jamel, I actually believe that the wealth gap and the attack on wealth is the greatest problem that the African American community suffers from. Because I contend this, Ms. Price, if folk don't like you and you can still buy a smile, it doesn't really matter. If they're racist or prejudiced and you own your own business and you can employ your own, that emotional discussion does not matter, because in terms of wealth, you have more control over your destiny.
That's right. I just heard you talking about power. Owning, having control over your land and having ownership gives you some skin in the game, some political clout. That's how we build power. That's how we build power.
So we've been speaking with Ms. Ann Price, Director of Closing the Racial Wealth Gap Initiative for Insight Center for Community Economic Development. And I wanted you to really let our listeners know where they can learn more about your work and find some of these great reports that you all put out.
We're at the Insight Center for Community Economic Development. You can find us on the web of that name. You can also locally join up with LA Best, Louisiana's building economic security together. And I think that Ms. Joyce James is really working across the state. I mean, she's building leadership and community across the state to address these issues, and looking at the issue of legacy and thinking about how we build legacy and how Louisiana will build legacy in communities of color. So there are efforts afoot, and I think that understanding and learning about what wealth really is and how we can help our children get there is the most important thing we can do right now.
Great. Thank you for joining us. We've been speaking with Ms. Ann Price, Director of Closing the Racial Wealth Gap Initiative. Stick with us after the break. We're going to be joined by Mr. Jeff Hebert, Executive Director of NORA, the New Orleans Redevelopment Authority, and we're talking about NORA's strategy to address affordable housing, commercial revitalization, and land stewardship. You've been listening to the Good Morning Show on WBOK. Real talk for real times.